The year is 404 BCE, and Athens is a ghost of its former glory. The city's golden age has ended in the dust and blood of a catastrophic defeat. The Peloponnesian War, a brutal 27-year conflict with Sparta, has bled the Athenian Empire dry, leaving behind a legacy of paranoia and rage. In the power vacuum, a brutal Spartan-backed oligarchy, the 30 Tyrants, seizes control of the city. Their reign is a nightmare of state-sanctioned terror, where property is confiscated and thousands of democratic citizens are executed without trial. Amidst this chaos walks a peculiar figure, a man of unconventional wisdom and even more unconventional appearance, Socrates. He is the city's gadfly, a relentless questioner who claims to know only one thing, that he knows nothing. But in a city raw with defeat and desperate for scapegoats, his questions are seen not as wisdom, but as a dangerous poison. The restored democracy, fragile and fearful, begins to view its greatest thinker as its greatest threat. The Athens that Socrates inhabited was a city of contradictions, a place that birthed democracy, but was now terrified of the free thought that sustained it. The war had shattered their confidence in their own institutions and leaders. The city was suffering from a deep-seated trauma, a collective wound that festered with suspicion. Anyone who challenged the fragile, newly restored order was seen not as a patriot, but as a potential traitor. Socrates' method was deceptively simple and utterly infuriating. He would approach a man renowned for his wisdom, a general, a politician, a poet, and engage him in a dialogue about the nature of a concept like justice, courage, or piety. Through a series of relentless, incisive questions, he would unravel the man's confident assertions, exposing the shallow foundations of his supposed knowledge. The end result was always the same. The expert was left speechless and humiliated, his intellectual arrogance shattered in a public forum. This intellectual dissection was not a parlor game, it was a philosophical mission. Years earlier, his friend Chaerephon had visited the Oracle at Delphi, the most sacred site in the Greek world, and asked if anyone was wiser than Socrates. The Pythia, the priestess of Apollo, had answered with a definitive no. Socrates was baffled by this divine proclamation, as he believed he knew nothing. He concluded that his wisdom must lie in his awareness of his own ignorance, a stark contrast to the false certainty of others. This divine mission, as he saw it, was to be a gadfly to the lazy horse of the Athenian state. He believed he was a gift from the gods, sent to sting the city into a state of self-examination and moral wakefulness. But the horse did not want to be awoken. The powerful men he publicly embarrassed did not thank him for the lesson in humility. They harbored a deep and bitter resentment. They saw him not as a divine messenger, but as an arrogant, disruptive, and dangerous social irritant. The charge of impiety, or asebeia, was a serious one in Athens. It wasn't just about personal belief. It was about honoring the city's gods and participating in public rituals that were believed to ensure the state's safety and prosperity. To be accused of impiety was to be accused of endangering the entire community. The accusers claimed Socrates failed to acknowledge the gods of the state and instead introduced new, unfamiliar, divine matters. This accusation likely stemmed from his references to his daemonion, a private divine voice or sign he claimed had warned him away from making mistakes since childhood. It never told him what to do, only what not to do. To his fellow Athenians, steeped in a tradition of public oracles and communal worship, this private, unsanctioned spiritual guide sounded like a rejection of the city's gods. It was a form of heresy, a dangerous introduction of a personal, daimonic power that operated outside the state's control. The second charge was even more insidious, corrupting the youth. This was a political, not a moral, accusation. It meant he was turning the city's most promising young men against the established order and democratic values. The prosecution had a devastating list of his former associates who had, in fact, turned against Athens. Chief among them were Alcibiades and Critias, two names that would have sent a shiver of dread through any Athenian juror. Alcibiades was the brilliant, handsome, and tragically flawed Athenian general whose ambition and treachery had prolonged the Peloponnesian War. He had defected to Sparta, then to Persia, before returning to Athens, his every move dictated by a monstrous ego that Socrates had famously tried and failed to temper. His association with Socrates was used as proof that the philosopher's teachings fostered a dangerous, anti-democratic individualism and a contempt for Athenian law. Even more damning was Socrates' connection to Critias. Critias was not just an enemy of the state. He was the leader of the 30 Tyrants, the butcher who had overseen the reign of terror just a few years earlier. He had been a member of Socrates' inner circle. The prosecution could now paint a terrifying picture. Socrates, the teacher, had personally mentored the man who became Athens' most hated tyrant. It was the ultimate evidence that his philosophy didn't create virtuous citizens, but monstrous megalomaniacs. The primary accuser was Meletus, a young, unknown poet, likely a puppet for more powerful men. He was the face of the prosecution, but the real force behind it was Aenetus, a wealthy and influential politician. Aenetus was a restored democrat who had suffered under the 30 Tyrants and harbored a deep personal grudge against Socrates. He believed Socrates' endless questioning undermined the traditional values and respect for authority needed to keep Athens stable. The third accuser, Lycon, was a rhetorician, a professional orator. His presence was strategic, meant to represent the anger of the professional class whom Socrates had so often humiliated in public debate. Together, these three men embodied the coalition of forces arrayed against the philosopher: artistic obscurity, political power, and professional jealousy. They were not seeking justice. They were seeking the elimination of a man who made them feel small and foolish. The trial was held in the Heliaea, the Supreme Court of Athens. It was not a quiet, deliberative affair with a single judge. The jury, or dicastery, was massive, 501 male citizens chosen by lot. This was democracy in its rawest form. The verdict would not be decided by legal precedent, but by the shifting moods, prejudices, and fears of a massive crowd. Socrates was not facing a court of law. He was facing the embodiment of the Athenian mob. Socrates, now 70 years old, was given a chance to speak in his own defense. His student, Plato, would later immortalize this speech in his work, The Apology. But Socrates did not offer an apology in the modern sense of the word. He offered a defense, a defiant and uncompromising justification of his entire life. He did not beg, he did not flatter the jury, and he did not bring his weeping wife and children to court to beg for sympathy, a common and often effective tactic in Athenian trials. He systematically dismantled the charges. He called Meletus to the stand and, using his famous method, quickly tied him in logical knots, making him look like a fool who didn't even understand his own accusations. He ridiculed the idea that he, one man, could corrupt all the youth while the rest of Athens improved them. He explained that his poverty was proof he was not a sophist who charged high fees for their teaching. He was not teaching anyone anything, he claimed. He was simply searching for wisdom alongside them. Then he delivered the core of his defense, the part that would seal his fate. He told the jury about his divine mission from the Oracle at Delphi. He declared that he would not stop practicing philosophy even if they were to acquit him on that condition. To stop questioning, he argued, would be to disobey the god. The unexamined life is not worth living, he told them, a statement of such profound conviction that it was also a direct challenge to their authority. He warned them that if they killed him, they would not be harming him, but themselves. They would be swatting the gadfly sent to awaken them and would spend the rest of your lives asleep. He was not arguing for his life. He was indicting his accusers and the entire city for their intellectual laziness and moral cowardice. It was a speech of breathtaking arrogance and equally breathtaking integrity. He was forcing the jury into an impossible position. Either admit he was right or silence him forever. The vote was cast. Each juror placed a bronze disc into one of two urns, one for acquittal, one for conviction. The result was terrifyingly close. 280 jurors voted guilty, 220 voted to acquit. Had just 31 men voted differently, he would have walked free. But the verdict was clear. Socrates, the wisest man in Athens, had been found guilty of impiety and corrupting the youth. The trial then entered a second phase. The prosecution proposed a penalty, death. Under Athenian law, the convicted defendant was allowed to propose a counter-penalty. This was Socrates' chance to save his own life. His friends urged him to suggest exile, a common and acceptable alternative. A plea for imprisonment or a hefty fine would almost certainly have been accepted by the jury, who likely wanted to humiliate him, not kill him. Socrates, however, refused to compromise. In a final act of defiance and irony, he considered what he truly deserved from the state. He, who had spent his life serving the city as its philosophical gadfly, benefiting everyone, should be rewarded, not punished. He proposed his counter-penalty, that he be given free meals for life at the Prytaneum, the sacred public hearth where Olympic heroes and state benefactors were honored. It was the highest honor the city could bestow. The jury was utterly enraged. This was not a plea for mercy. It was the ultimate insult. He was mocking the court, mocking their power, and mocking the very concept of justice. Any sympathy they might have had for the old man evaporated in a wave of collective fury. He had thrown their chance for a compromise back in their faces. Reluctantly, he offered to pay a small fine, which his wealthy friends, including Plato, immediately offered to increase to a very large sum, but the damage was done. The second vote was on the penalty, the prosecution's death sentence or Socrates' proposed fine. This time, the margin was much larger. Many who had voted to acquit him now voted for his death, incensed by his arrogance. The final tally was 360 for death, 141 against. Socrates was condemned to die by drinking a cup of poison hemlock. In his final address to the court, Socrates was serene. He spoke to those who had voted to condemn him, telling them they had chosen to live with the guilt of killing an innocent man. He prophesied that others, younger and more aggressive, would rise to question them in his place. He then turned to the jurors who had voted for his acquittal, his friends. He comforted them, arguing that death was not something to be feared. It was either a dreamless sleep or a journey to another place. He imagined a glorious afterlife where he could continue his philosophical questioning, conversing with the great heroes and thinkers of the past, like Homer and Odysseus. In the underworld, he mused, they don't kill you for asking questions. The hour of departure has arrived, he concluded, and we go our ways, I to die and you to live, which is better God only knows. He was then led away by the court guards, leaving his accusers victorious and his followers utterly devastated. Socrates was taken to the Desmoterion, the state prison of Athens, a grim, foul-smelling place near the Agora. But his execution was not to be immediate. A cruel twist of religious timing intervened. The day before his trial, the sacred galley, the ship that reenacted Theseus's mythical journey to Crete, had set sail for the holy island of Delos. During this annual mission, a period of ritual purity was observed in Athens, and no state executions could be carried out. This meant Socrates had to wait in his cell for the ship to return, a period that lasted for about a month. For his followers, it was a time of agonizing suspense. For Socrates, it was an opportunity for one final series of philosophical conversations. His cell became an unlikely classroom where his friends could visit him daily. They found him not in despair, but calm, cheerful, and as intellectually engaged as ever, ready to debate the most profound questions of life and death. One of his oldest and wealthiest friends was a man named Crito. Crito was a simple, loyal man who loved Socrates deeply, but often struggled to grasp the full depth of his philosophy. He was a man of action, not of abstract principles. He could not bear the thought of his friend being unjustly executed, and he was tormented by the public shame of being seen as someone who was too cowardly or too cheap to save his friend's life. Before dawn one morning, Crito came to the prison. He had used his wealth to bribe the guards and had arranged a complete escape plan. A ship was waiting, and a safe exile in Thessaly was prepared. All Socrates had to do was walk out. Crito pleaded with him, appealing to his duties as a father to his sons and to his friends who would be lost without him. He argued that to stay and die would be to collude with the injustice of his enemies. Socrates listened patiently before beginning his gentle but devastating counter-argument, immortalized in Plato's dialogue, the Crito asterisk. He asked his friend to imagine that as they were about to escape, the laws and the state of Athens appeared before them as spectral figures. What would they say? They would argue that Socrates was their child and slave, born, raised, and educated under their protection. He had lived in Athens for 70 years, rarely leaving, a sign that he was content with its laws. These spectral laws would argue that Socrates had entered into a tacit agreement, a social contract, to obey their commands. He was free to leave at any time if he was displeased, but by choosing to stay, he had agreed to their terms. To now flee would be to break this sacred pact. It would be an act of destruction against the very concept of law. For what state can exist if its laws are ignored by private citizens whenever they see fit? Socrates argued that injustice should not be met with injustice. His enemies had wronged him, but that did not give him the right to wrong the state in return by breaking its laws. To do so would be to betray his entire life's philosophy, which held that it is better to suffer injustice than to commit it. His escape would validate his accuser's claims that he had no respect for the law. In death, he would be a victim of the injustice of men. In escape, he would become a perpetrator of injustice against the law itself. Crito had no answer. Socrates' argument was unassailable. He chose to honor the abstract principles of law and justice over his own survival. He would not become a fugitive, scurrying from city to city in his old age, his reputation ruined. He would face his punishment with the same integrity with which he had lived his life. He would obey the verdict of Athens, even as it murdered him, to prove his ultimate loyalty to the ideal of a lawful society. The day of the execution finally arrived. The sacred ship from Delos had been sighted, its return signaling that the city's period of purity was over. In the early morning, Socrates' closest friends gathered at the prison for the last time. When they were allowed into his cell, they found him with his wife, Xanthippe, and their young son. Xanthippe was hysterical with grief, and Socrates calmly asked Crito to have her taken home so that her sorrow would not disturb their final conversation. With Xanthippe gone, Socrates sat on his bed, rubbing his leg where the heavy chains had just been removed. He remarked on the strange relationship between pain and pleasure, how one seems to follow the other. This simple observation sparked the last and greatest of his philosophical discussions, the one recorded by Plato in the Phaedo asterisk. As the sun rose higher, casting its last rays on the philosopher, he and his friends debated the ultimate question, the immortality of the soul. Socrates argued that the true philosopher spends his entire life preparing for death. Philosophy, he claimed, is a kind of training for dying. The body is a prison, a source of endless distractions, desires, and fears that cloud the mind's pursuit of pure knowledge and truth. Death, therefore, is not an end, but a liberation. The moment the soul is finally freed from its physical cage to apprehend the world of eternal forms and pure ideas. His friends raised objections, fearing that the soul might simply dissipate like smoke upon death. Socrates, patient and methodical even in his final hours, addressed their fears with a series of complex arguments. He spoke of the cyclical nature of life and death, of the soul's recollection of knowledge from a past existence, and of the soul's affinity with the divine and indestructible. He painted a picture of a cosmic justice where the virtuous soul finds a blessed existence, while the impure soul is condemned to wander the earth as a ghost. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation drew to a close. A prison official, a man who had grown to respect Socrates, entered the cell. With tears in his eyes, he informed Socrates that the time had come. He praised Socrates as the noblest, gentlest, and best man who had ever entered the prison, and then turned away, weeping, unable to watch. Socrates, with perfect composure, asked for the poison to be brought. Crito made one last, desperate plea for delay. The sun was not yet set, he argued. Other condemned men ate and drank, prolonging their lives until the very last moment. Socrates gently rebuked him. To cling to a life that was already spent, he said, would be ridiculous. He had made his peace with the world and was ready for the journey. He calmly asked again for the cup of poison. The executioner, the state official responsible for administering the poison, entered the cell. He carried a simple earthenware cup containing a greenish, murky liquid, the juice of the hemlock plant. Hemlock was a brutally efficient poison. It worked by paralyzing the nervous system, starting from the extremities and moving upward. The victim would remain conscious as a creeping, icy numbness spread through their body, until it finally reached the heart and lungs, causing death by asphyxiation. Socrates asked the executioner for instructions. The man, avoiding eye contact, explained that after drinking the poison, Socrates should walk around until his legs felt heavy, and then lie down. The poison would do the rest. Socrates simply nodded. He took the cup in his hand, and according to Plato, without a tremor, without any change of color or expression, he raised it to his lips. Before he drank, he made a final gesture of piety. He asked if it was permissible to pour a small amount as a libation, a drink offering to the gods. The executioner informed him that they only prepared the exact amount needed to kill one man. "I understand," Socrates replied, "but I can and must pray to the gods that my journey from this world to the other may be a fortunate one." He said his prayer, and then, calmly and cheerfully, he drained the cup. Up to this point, his friends had managed to control their emotions, but when they saw him drink the poison, their composure shattered. Crito turned away, unable to watch. Another friend, Apollodorus, who had been weeping all along, let out a loud, agonized wail that broke the tension in the room. The sound of his grief was infectious, and soon all the men in the cell, except for Socrates himself, were overcome by tears. Socrates alone remained calm. He gently chided them. "What is this strange outcry?" he asked. "I sent the women away mainly so that they would not misbehave in this way, for I have been told that a man should die in peace." His words, full of gentle authority, shamed them into silence. They covered their faces and tried to contain their tears, stunned by his incredible courage and self-control in the face of his own agonizing death. As the executioner had instructed, Socrates began to walk around the small cell. His friends watched in horrified silence as he paced back and forth, waiting for the poison to take hold. After a few moments, he said that his legs were beginning to feel heavy. He then lay down on his back on the small cot, as he had been told. The chilling, methodical process of his own death had begun. The executioner, who had been observing the process, came over to him. He pinched Socrates' foot and asked if he could feel it. Socrates said no. The man then pinched his leg higher up. Again, there was no feeling. He explained to the grieving friends that as the coldness and numbness reached his heart, he would be gone. The creeping paralysis was ascending his body, a visible tide of death that his friends were forced to witness in slow, agonizing detail. The cold was now spreading over his abdomen. At this point, Socrates uncovered his face, which he had covered a moment before. He looked at his friend Crito and spoke his final, enigmatic words. "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Please, don't forget to pay the debt." These were the last words he ever uttered. Crito promised that it would be paid and asked if he had any other final requests. There was no reply. A moment later, Socrates' body gave a slight shudder. The executioner uncovered him completely. His eyes were fixed in a final stare. Crito, seeing that his friend was gone, reached down and gently closed his mouth and his eyes. The wisest, most just, and best man Athens had ever known was dead, murdered by the very city he had tried so desperately to save from its own ignorance. Socrates' last words have puzzled scholars for centuries. Asclepius was the Greek god of healing. One traditionally sacrificed a rooster to him after recovering from an illness. Was Socrates implying that life itself is a kind of sickness and that death is the cure? Was he suggesting his soul was now healed, freed from the prison of his body? Or was it a simpler gesture, perhaps paying a debt on behalf of a friend? Whatever the meaning, his final utterance was not one of despair, but one of pious duty and philosophical tranquility. The death of Socrates sent a shockwave through Athens, though its immediate effects are debated by historians. Plato and other followers fled the city, fearing they might be the next targets of the democratic regime's paranoia. According to later sources, the Athenians soon felt a powerful remorse for their actions. They allegedly closed the gymnasiums in mourning, exiled his accusers, and even executed Meletus. While likely an exaggeration, this legend speaks to the powerful sense of guilt that came to be associated with the trial. The real legacy of Socrates was not built in Athens, but in the minds of those he inspired. His greatest student, Plato, was so profoundly shaped by his master's trial and death that it became the central event of his philosophical work. Through Plato's brilliant dialogues, Socrates was transformed from a historical figure into the ultimate archetype of the philosopher, a fearless martyr for truth who chose death over intellectual compromise. It is almost entirely through Plato's lens that we know Socrates at all. Plato's student, Aristotle, would in turn tutor Alexander the Great, carrying the Socratic tradition of rational inquiry to the ends of the known world. The intellectual chain reaction, started by a single barefoot questioner in the Athenian market, would go on to form the very bedrock of Western philosophy, science, and ethics. The questions Socrates asked are still the questions we ask today. What is justice? What is a good life? How should we live? The execution of Socrates stands as a terrifying and eternal warning about the fragility of freedom of thought. It demonstrates how a democracy, in a grip of fear and clinging to unquestioned traditions, can turn on its most brilliant minds. The state, which Socrates believed he had a duty to obey, used its power not to protect its citizens, but to silence a dissenting voice that made it uncomfortable. The cup of hemlock was not just poison for a man, it was poison for the spirit of free inquiry itself. Socrates could have saved himself at any point. He could have stopped questioning, he could have fled into exile, he could have begged for his life at the trial. He chose none of these paths. He believed that the purpose of life was the pursuit of virtue and knowledge, and a life without that pursuit was not worth living at all. In his death, he achieved his ultimate philosophical victory. He proved that there are principles, like truth and integrity, for which a person should be willing to die. The city of Athens eventually recovered, but it would forever be known as both the cradle of democracy and the city that killed its wisest man. The trial of Socrates is not merely a historical event. It is a foundational myth of our intellectual heritage. It is the story of a confrontation between the individual conscience and the power of the state, between the courage of free thought and the terror of the mob. It is a chilling reminder that the greatest threat to a society is not the one who asks difficult questions, but the one who demands they be silenced.